Gore Vidal is America's greatest living man of letters. For 50 years, his novels, essays, stage and screenplays have delighted and shocked his public, while his political views have never been less than radical.
It's just fresh.
He's the wittiest of all American writers. Most of us aren't witty at all. He has a rather prickly personality, you know. How popular do you expect a porcupine to be?
Taking pictures here.
I'm still trying to look natural.
He was beautiful. I mean, people flirted with him, male and female. His sexuality was such that it was there for all.
I follow him in the press. I follow him as a politician. I follow him as a friend. He is one of the players in American politics and has been over the last 30 years and more.
There is something about this facade, this impenetrable wit and intelligence that doesn't easily lend itself to an image of a man, you know, suffering little children onto his lap, but in his own way, he's very sweet.
I would cast him as a psychopathic killer.
Are you enjoying writing your memoir?
Well, I don't know if enjoy is quite the verb. It's rather significant in the life of anybody, I suppose. When you get to the memoir, you know the life is just about done with. It's the sort of thing you put off till last. Sort of thing I thought I'd put off for good. You can only tell the truth about the people that you've known in fiction. That's why we invented fiction. There are a lot of problems to writing a memoir. I think it might be better just to call it a tissue of lies and make it all up, with its central character being an invented character like myself. Many things interest me, but I don't seem to have caught my own attention over the years. And I feel I'm writing about a stranger when I reconstruct my life. I found one thing interesting. I must ask some other memoirists about this. There's not one moment that I would like to relive. And it's been quite a contented life, perhaps too contented. But I find that odd because almost everybody said, oh, that summer and Lake Annecy was the high point of my life, et cetera, et cetera. There's been none of that.
But is that there's no sort of great love affair in your life which has prompted you, or?
Well, there was one very early, and one was early enough. I don't think it happens twice. There are some people who I think are partial to the notion, particularly kids, of having a twin. And all that I was not, he was, and all that he was not, I was, and the two of us would have been pretty good had we been rolled into one. He was killed 50 years ago, March 1st, at Iwo Jima. And so doing the memoirs, I was somewhat haunted by him. And I was intrigued by another self that didn't survive. I was very interested in sex. I was not interested in love affairs. And I'm not going to be able to write an agony story. But I might find a few jokes along the way.
Is that because there really wasn't any agony?
Well, if there was, I'm a stoic. Or so I like to think, and so I was brought up. When you're brought up by a blind man who was accidentally blinded by the age of 10 and made his way in the world, self-pity is very hard to indulge in when you live with somebody like that. I was brought up in the house of my grandfather, Senator T.P. Gore.
Friends, to obtain votes with false promises is worse than to obtain money with false pretense.
My grandfather was an extraordinary influence on me. He sort of taught me to read, got me interested in history, got me interested in literature, certainly got me interested in politics, certainly got me interested in the politics of the people. He was an old populist. And what is considered my left-wing positions are nothing but the positions of the party of the people.
But I will never rob your cradles to feed the dogs of war.
I was brought up in Washington. It was a nice place to grow up in, but it was, after all, it was a small southern town. I think there were about 300,000 people. Everybody knew everybody else. The race war was not as intense as it now is. It was a company town. Politics was the only subject that anybody ever talked about. But really, the only thing attractive to me in the city is the White House. It's the only game in town. I would put up with Washington if one could live there. But driving around, I am struck over and over again. This is a city of the dead. Everywhere you look, there's a memorial to somebody who's been shot. It's a very creepy city to me now, and I must say I don't really care to go back. After my birth, my father, my mother, and I moved to Rock Creek Park, the house of Senator Gore, her father, and is now the residence of the Malaysian ambassador. And his wife, very charming woman.
I was placed in a drawer.
Here we lived, off and on, for the first 10 years of my life. And as living with the in-laws is a sure route to divorce. In due course, my parents did divorce, but I was very, very happy with my proper parents, my grandfather and my grandmother.
I was prematurely taught to read by my grandmother so that she would be able to do other things than read to him. He was blind from the age of 10, and so he was always read to all day long. So I learned to read at 5 and 6, and I was really reading grown-up books to him at 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Did you like to read to your grandfather?
Oh, yes. He was very interesting, very witty man, and he would explain enough of the text so I knew what was happening. I read a lot of history to him. I was bored by the congressional record, you know, that kind of stuff. On the other hand, by the age of 10, I understood bimetallism, which I don't think any 10-year-old has ever understood, and the meaning of fiat money. So, because he was on the Banking and Currency Committee. In his day, the entire top of the house was one long, raw room with just plain deal wood floors and 20,000 books. And I was constantly reading, and I would sit in, these windows are set in rather funny embrasures, which would just fit a seated child. And I would sit there and read, removed from the house and removed from the world. I began to suspect that a writer had been born when I first read a book just to myself, not aloud. And as I began to read it, I started to think of an alternative work to the one I was reading. I was all of 7 then. The book was called The Duck and the Kangaroo, a tale of unnatural affection. So I began to write my own version of this while I was reading it. And by the time I was 14, I think I'd started about 3 novels. And Willowa, my first published novel, written when I was 19, must have been about my 7th attempt. So, you know, one was a novelist. And I had the good, or I think perhaps bad fortune of being published very early, before I was ripe enough Tennessee Williams always said, "It's a pity, Gore, that you became so successful so young. You always got to see the world from a successful person's perspective." Tennessee was extremely hard on other people's characters. I often felt that about him, too. But there was something in it, perhaps, that I was recording life at a point before I really quite understood what I was recording. And then, rather naturally, thanks to my childhood in this room, in this house, history and politics were, the air I breathed, the way my brain worked. So it was inevitable that I would go in those directions. I used to bring my grandfather down there when I was 8.
He brought you down.
No, he was blind. Yeah. And I came on the floor on a hot summer day in a bathing suit. And in those days, in a bathing suit, nothing else, barefoot, because in those days you took off your shoes in June, didn't put them on until September. And I remember then we went onto the floor, and I sat down beside him. Mm-hmm. Everything's very relaxed, and suddenly the vice president, Mr. John Nance Garner,
Cactus Jack,
Cactus Jack came down and said, "Senator, that boy is naked." And my grandfather, who had been holding my arm like that as I walked along, I had short sleeves, he thought I was listening. So his arm went a little further down, and he sprinted out of there, blind as he was.
You know the history of this table. It's called the treaty table.
Well, it was always pretty clear to me that I was going to be a writer, whether I liked it or not. And I'm not so sure I did like it all that much, as I wanted to be a politician, like my grandfather. But I've quickly figured out that the writer has just one job, which is to tell the truth as he understands it, whereas the politician has only one thing in view, and that is never to give the game away. So the two things are in opposition.
Do you think without your grandfather, you'd have written the historical novels and the classical ones?
Can't tell. I don't know how else I would have been brought up, but certainly it made them easy for me. It made them inevitable, because between him and me, our lives span, I think it's over half or 2/3 of the life of the Republic. And he remembers his grandfather, who was in the Revolution. So this is a straight line to the beginning. So to me, the American history was always a family affair. That's why I chose to, in those novels like Burr and Washington, D.C., to tell it through the eyes of one family, as indeed one family might have experienced it all. Had it not been for him and the fact that I was exposed to politicians and the floor of the Senate and all these books, who knows, I might have been a really serious and important novelist who would write about the only important subject, which is marriage. I was very close to my father. He had a charming and serene disposition. He was a very droll man. And he was an inventor. He was a true artist.
Found out whether or not a 10-year-old youngster could handle it. What do you think?
Sure, I'll try it.
My father was eager to find a popular plane, a cheap plane. In fact, I think he dreamed of being the Henry Ford of aviation. So he was forever coming up with prototypes of cheap airplanes that were absolutely safe, so safe that even I, at the age of 10, could fly it. He was rather mean. So was the senator. But one of the reasons they were so fond of me was at the age of 17, I enlisted in the Army, so the government paid for me. By the time I got out of the Army, when I was 19, I'd already written my first book. From then on, I never cost them a penny. My father and I never